Chapter 1100 of One Piece showed us the final parts of Kuma's flashback, finally showing us how he became a Shichibukai and lost his life, but in the process this ties together so many events in the story that we finally get explanations to small mysteries from 15 years ago, among many other hidden details and references, so allow me to break them all down within this chapter. As the chapter opens, we see Kizaru visiting Vegapunk at would-be Egghead. At this time he still had his traditional hat, which if you don't know, is known as a Borsalino hat, hence the Admiral's name. This look was based on Kuni Tanaka's look in the classic Japanese comedy film Trakiaro, which features even the iconic glasses. Kizaru complains how the island is really cold, much unlike Punk Hazard, as the island aircon was still not installed yet. This may be confusing given how Punk Hazard is half frozen at the present, but you have to keep in mind that prior to the duel between Akainu and Aokishi 2 years ago, the island was originally a very vibrant and nature-filled island, though that was until Caesar ruined its ecosystem at this time 4 years ago. As a small detail, you can also see Vegapunk's head popping out of his speech bubble because it's simply too big. Present on the island is also Egghead Drake, who is accompanying Kizaru on the mission. This is before he became an undercover pirate, that there's actually a way bigger relevance to him being present here that finally explains a random scene of foreshadowing that took place 15 years ago. During the Sabaody arc, Drake was confronted by a pacifista and he exclaimed, "Vegapunk, in addition to Bartholomew Kuma's body, you reproduced Kizaru's ability as well? I had no idea the pacifista had developed this far." Drake had known about the Pacifista project, about the cloning of Kuma and Kizaru's ability, because Drake was there when the Pacifista project began during this chapter, finally explaining that bit of foreshadowing, which back then already told us that it was Vegapunk who cloned Kuma, as well as replicated Kizaru's laser Delfruit ability all those years ago before any of these concepts were even introduced. Vegapunk then enters a call with Saint J. Garcia Saturn in a special Denden Mushi that appears slightly larger than normal models, also featuring a special shell with spikes, like that of a seashell, so I wonder if it's just a visual detail or if this is a special model reserved for people like him. Just as we had deduced last chapter, Saturn forced Kuma into an agreement, forcing him to become a warlord and augment his body as a cyborg, which was not part of Vegapunk's original plan. However, as most warlords do not follow orders, Saturn demands for Kuma to abandon his sense of will and be fully controllable. This is why Kuma was famously known as the most obedient of the warlords, always following each of their orders, which made Moria wonder what Kuma's true motives really were, something that we now finally know. Vegapunk is indignated by this, something we saw a glimpse of when he talked with Bonnie, explaining how he was also outraged at having to follow through with killing Kuma, but had no other choice to comply since it was Kuma's wish, happy to make a very literal deal with the devil with Saturn if he can save Bonnie's life. Just we see later, Vegapunk made a promise to Kuma to never tell Bonnie about this because she was the reason why Kuma gave up his life, but he never wanted Bonnie to find out about it. We get an outline timeline for the rest of the flashback as well, with Bonnie's treatment taking 6 months, which ends up later within this year, still 4 years ago. Then a year later, towards the end of 3 years ago, and few months before the start of the series, Bonnie would be fully cured and would be able to go out into the sunlight, letting her become healthy before the age of 10. As she would turn 10 with the turn of the next year, just as she said, she would set out to sea with Gyogyo and the others to become a pirate and escape from the Sorbet kingdom. This explains why Akainu was so afraid when Bonnie had escaped from the government, because she was the only bargaining chip they had against Kuma. This also finally explains why Bonnie outlived her usefulness, as since Kuma lost all sense of will, they don't need to keep her around anymore. Saturn was even willing to let Bonnie go and not focus on her, claiming her to be just a little girl and perhaps in some way even honoring part of that original agreement, though maybe he just didn't see her worth his time either way. On the other hand, Kuma's modifications would take 2 years, going until the spring of 1522, 2 years ago, when Kuma became a full robot and lost his sense of self right between Sabaody and Marineford. This is why he told Luffy that they would not meet again, not because Luffy was going to die, but because Kuma himself was the one who was going to die. Kuma, however, is imposed that he mustn't meet Bonnie after these 6 months to ensure that they don't escape together. This would explain why Bonnie and Kuma did not meet in Sabaody despite the close range, but it does bring into question if Kuma was aware of Bonnie's pirating career yet, because if he did, he would have no reason to go through with fully dying yet, but I'm sure that would be explained by Oda soon enough. Vegapunk then begins developing the pacifista, but begins to express how he wishes there were several more of him that could help him, expressing that he wished a cat could lend him a hand. This is a Japanese expression that essentially means having someone lending you a hand, which is the reason behind the satellites having the kanji reading for cat. As a small detail too, some of these lines Vegapunk utters are lifted word by word from the Egghead promotional video by Calliope Mori, which Oda expressed greatly admiring and liking. Followingly, we see Kuma beginning to go through his treatment, and as a cool detail, the machine where he's being treated is the exact same that we saw in the brief flashback image of Kuma being modified all the way back in Marineford, showing a nice degree of consistency. The modifications on his shoulders are very similar to those shown in that panel too. And to top that all off, Vegapunk's outfit during his first encounter with Kuma is also the same exact outfit that Kuma depicted him in when we first got a glimpse of Vegapunk 15 years ago, with gloves and a striped shirt. Across these panels, we can also see what would be Egghead beginning to be built up, with cargo of materials arriving on the island to erect all the buildings. On the ship is the writing Umit cargo ship, and this is actually quite the deep reference, as it's referring to Umit, one of the emperors of the underworld who attended Big Mom's tea party. He is known as a shipping magnate called the Deep Ocean Current, who provides materials all across the world. The symbol on the ship even resembles that of his hat. We then also see Kuma, Bonnie, Vegapunk, Sentomaru, and Kizaru eating a giant pizza all together, which showcases to us how these people all became close together, only to fatefully end up fighting the Straw Hats side by side in Sabaody. Bonnie's expression when seeing pizza, her favorite food, is the same one Genie had when seeing food, and in a nice touch by the end of it, they all end up dancing to the tune of Nika as they sing out the drums of liberation. This also explains why Sentomaru saved Bonnie and why Kizaru was struggling to hurt her. Finally, 6 months pass and Bonnie's treatment concludes. Vegapunk still has his whole brain here, which makes sense as Bonnie was shocked when Vegapunk cut his brain, as he only created punk records and the satellites after this, within the span of the past 2-3 years, since he already had his head cut off before the time Kuma became a full cyborg, when, they had that scene with their talk about the soul and memories. Bonnie asks if she can visit the island in the future again, which is painfully ironic because next time she would come to kill Vegapunk. They finally return to Sorbet, where Bonnie reunites with Connie. We point out last chapter how Connie seemingly gave Bonnie her iconic hat, but some pointed out the discrepancy of the hat having darker colors there compared to Bonnie's brighter hat. This error has been rectified by Oda, with Connie now wearing a new hat with lighter colors that matches the hat Bonnie would inherit. The one who takes care of looking after Bonnie, or rather looking that she doesn't escape, is Cypherpol 8 Agent Alpha. Now you may be confused and think, isn't this just Khalifa? She looks identical and is a Cypherpol agent, but she can't be her, because Khalifa would at this time be in an undercover mission in Water 7 as a secretary of Galela, and was part of CP9 anyway, not CP8. So the obvious answer is that this is most likely Khalifa's twin sister, Alpha, which makes sense as both of their names are very similar, Khalifa and Alpha, a pattern that is even more obvious when written in Japanese. Though there's also the possibility that she could be a clone like Stussy, but it's hard to say, as Lasky, Khalifa's father, could have easily had twin daughters that he both recruited into the Cypher Pole after himself. Around the church we can also see some iron walls and fences being erected, essentially turning it into a prison of limited access to ensure that Bonnie doesn't escape. But when you think about it, it actually makes so much sense how it is that Bonnie escaped from the government. Because think about it, if Bonnie escaped while literally wearing Connie's clothes and hat, and has used this tactic to infiltrate places before, it makes perfect sense. She got past the government guards by disguising as Connie, hat and all, and then set out to sea with Gyogyo and the others before the government could realize, keeping the hat while on her journey as a memento of Connie. Considering how Khalifa was, not exactly the sharpest tool in the shed, let's say, I wouldn't be surprised if this was able to fool Alpha as well. As a final farewell, Kuma tells Bonnie, "Thank you, Bonnie, for being born and coming to see me." This line is incredibly powerful as it is actually written very similar in Japanese to the first line that Kuma's parents ever told him. "I'm glad you were born and came out to see us," bringing his whole story full circle. We then get to see the reaction by all the different warlords around the world to Kuma's promotion. Shure shows the news to Doflamingo, who expresses interest in Kuma, as the two would develop a strange relationship as warlords, traveling together to Marijoa during Jaya, and Doflamingo also explaining to Luffy and Ivankov during Marineford how Kuma was killed. Robin informs Crocodile, who asks her if she has disposed of those that spotted the rain-making ship, referring to the Fool, the ship that used dance powder to cause civil unrest in Alabasta, as any witnesses of it would have to be disposed of. Behind them, a Bananawani can also be seen chilling. We also see Mihawk, Hancock, Kobe, and a very delusional Elvida, and Ace, now part of the Whitebeard Pirates, alongside Whitebeard, Marco, Jinbe, and Teach, the year prior to Teach killing Thatch and stealing his fruit. Interestingly, Saturn stated, "The other day, thanks to a rookie called Ace, we are left with a vacant warlord position." It's unclear what this is referring to, as it could refer to Ace having defeated a warlord and thus leaving a position vacant. But it could also more simply refer to the time when Ace rejected the offer to become a warlord himself, so Saturn could be frustrated they couldn't fill it in with Ace and instead resorted to Kuma. The wording in Japanese is quite vague, so it's hard to completely say for sure. To put it into perspective, here's a quick timeline of the order in which of the current warlords joined the system. Around 1503, or around 21 years ago, Crocodile becomes a warlord in his mid-20s as part of his long plan towards Operation Utopia, so that he can operate within Alabasta. 1511, or around 13 years ago, Hancock is offered to become a warlord and accepts to protect Amazon Lily. 1513, or 11 years ago, Jinbe is offered to become a warlord and accepts to help liberate his crew and establish good relationships with Fishman Island and the government. 1514, or 10 years ago, Doflamingo blackmails the government to become a warlord in order to set up his plan later in the year of taking over Dressrosa and becoming its king. 1520, or 4 years ago, Ace is offered to become a warlord but turns the invitation down. 1520, or 4 years ago, Kuma is forced to become a warlord, its most recent one as of the start of the series. Then 1522, or 2 years ago, Teach and later Buggy become warlords, and over the time skip, Law and Weevil become warlords too, until the system is disbanded in the present of the story. The only ones we don't know about are Mihawk, who evidently became a warlord to just be left alone, and Moria, who was interested in pillaging ships to build up his zombie crew on Thriller Bark. Knowing that Moria settled in the Florian Triangle 10 years ago and began gathering zombies without being bothered by the government back then, I'd say it's likely around that time when he became a warlord. Speaking of which, we also see Moria here lazily chilling over his bed. We stole the news by Perona. Moria develops an interest in finding out how Kuma's powers work, which is an incredibly deep-cut reference which once again explains a mystery from the past 15 years, as Perona would later be taken by surprise by Kuma's powers, whereas Moria told him that he had learned and found out about how Kuma's abilities work, with this chapter showing why he became interested to find out about them to begin with. I know I'm repeating myself, but it's crazy we're finally understanding all these lines of dialogue from 15 years ago with this flashback. And finally we see Dragon, Sabo, Hack, and Koala, who are worried for Kuma and wound up rescuing him 4 years later when he be turned into a slave after protecting the ship of the Straw Hats. We conclude by switching back to Kuma, who is writing a letter to Bonnie, one he seemingly delivers through the new Scoo system. He is hunting down pirates on behalf of the government, having wiped out a pirate ship in this panel, also claiming to be hunted down by his fame, with other rookies trying to take down Shichibukai. We finally get a look at his ship, which is modeled after him, with a hole in the pattern of his hat and two massive bear ears. The front is in a shape similar to a cross, and the building on the ship appears to be modeled after his church as well. On the sail itself, unlikely the flag, is the writing Kuma with a drawing of his face. This drawing was actually the drawing that Bonnie made of Kuma, making this symbol an incredibly heartfelt detail. Kuma, however, happens to stumble in the most unexpected of locations of all places, being Fuchsia Village in the Goa Kingdom, Luffy's very own hometown, as we see him playing around with a tiger. Luffy here should be currently 15 years old as of 4 years ago, unless some months have passed since Kuma becoming a warlord and we have entered the next year where Luffy would be 16. But this is of course incurred the question, what is Kuma doing here? Of course, there's the possibility that this is only meant as a quick detail, and Kuma was just happening to pass by the island, but given the way the chapter dramatically ends, it does seem to be indicating that Kuma has a specific mission on the island, but which? The Great Terminal incident is a thing of the past, and there really aren't any relevant figures on the island aside from Luffy, unless, like Garb showed up or something, as I doubt that Kuma would really come after the Dan or anyone else. His presence on the panel would seem to imply the idea that Kuma is somehow coming after Luffy, but why? Did the government somehow con in on the fact that the Nika fruit was lost on the island? Could Kuma have covered up for Luffy all this time, misleading the government about the Nika fruit not being out there? Or is there something more to it? It's interesting to consider that Kuma knew that Luffy was Dragon's son, despite other people like Ivankov or everyone else in the Revolutionary Army not knowing about it. Did Dragon confide to Kuma sometime from father to father, or did Kuma somehow find out during this time, even if Luffy doesn't remember him? And it's not limited at just that. There's also the fact that as of Thriller Bark, Kuma was aware that Ace was Luffy's brother, a fact that was otherwise unknown to anyone else but someone like Garp and maybe those in the government close to him, but would they really have told a Shichibukai like Kuma? How did he come to know all of this stuff, and is it connected with his time in Luffy's village? We honestly don't have enough details to say for sure, but I'm sure that the truth will come apparent to us by next week.